The rain beat heavily against the windows of the car, creating a symphony of drops that seemed to increase the tension in the air. Jake was behind the wheel, his eyes fixed on the wet road ahead. The silence between us was almost palpable, charged with an electricity that made me uneasy. From time to time, he cast a furtive glance in my direction, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. My trembling hands adjusted the rearview mirror for the 5th time, without really needing to. I needed something to do, something to distract my mind from the whirlwind of emotions I was feeling. Jake snorted, breaking the silence. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice serious but with a hint of concern. "Yes, I am," I lied, trying to sound calmer than I really was. The truth was that I wasn't fine at all. My mind was stuck in a whirlpool of thoughts, one question repeating itself incessantly. How did we get to this point? How could a simple private driver mess up my life so much? The city lights reflected on the wet road, creating an almost surreal scene, as if we were in a noir movie. I wondered if Jake also felt the same tension, if he too was fighting the impulses that had led us there. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Jake said, without taking his eyes off the road. "I know," I replied, my voice almost a whisper. I wanted to ask so many questions, but the words wouldn't come out. How did we go from innocent conversations to this unbearable tension? What exactly were we looking for in each other? The silence settled again, but now it was filled with a tacit understanding, a kind of silent agreement. As the rain continued to fall, I realized that there was no turning back. We were on a path of no return, and every second that passed made it harder to ignore the feelings that were building up between us. My fingers lightly touched Jake's arm, and he looked at me, his eyes reflecting the same confusion and longing I felt. "We should talk about this, don't you think?" he suggested, his voice firm but gentle. "Maybe," I replied, not really knowing what to say. But not now. And so we continued, trapped in a silence laden with everything that couldn't be said, while the rainy night wrapped us in its cold, uncertain embrace. Jake started working as our private driver in Seattle on a typical fall day, when the leaves were falling and the air was cool. I remember that day well. Michael, my husband, had decided to hire a driver to make our hectic routine easier. When Jake showed up, the first thing I noticed was his smile. He had a charming, attentive manner that immediately captivated me. "Hi, I'm Jake. It's a pleasure to work for you," he said, extending his hand in greeting. I returned the gesture, feeling a slight current of electricity at the touch of his hand. "Nice to meet you, Jake. I'm Amanda," I replied, trying to keep my composure. It wasn't often that I felt so shaken by someone I'd just met, especially being married to Michael. That same day, I had to make a trip to the city center. Jake was at the wheel, and the journey, which would normally have been monotonous, turned into something unexpected. We chatted about trivial things at first, but the conversation quickly got deeper. I discovered that he had a genuine interest in hearing what I had to say, something I hadn't felt for a long time. "So, what do you like to do in your spare time?" he asked, looking in the rearview mirror to catch my answer. "I like to read, especially novels. And you?" I replied, trying to hide the blush that was rising to my cheeks. "I like music. I play guitar in my spare time," he said, with a smile that made my heart beat faster. The connection was immediate. It was as if I was talking to an old friend, someone who understood me, without me having to explain much, and that was dangerous. I was married to Michael, and our marriage, although stable, no longer had the spark it once had. Jake, with his sympathy and attention, brought back a feeling that I hadn't known was missing. During that trip downtown, I felt something I shouldn't have felt: attraction, desire. The conversation flowed naturally, and when we reached our destination, I didn't want it to end. "It was a pleasure talking to you, Jake," I don't think I've ever had such a pleasant trip, I confessed, trying to hide the anxiety in my voice. It was my pleasure, Amanda. I'm here for whatever you need, he replied. And there was something in the way he said it that made me feel it meant more than just a professional service. As the days went by, Jake and I continued to have these conversations during our daily runs. Each time he helped me out of the car, his touch seemed to last a little longer than necessary. And each time, an electric current ran through my body, leaving me yearning for more. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't help it. "Are you okay, Amanda?" Jake asked one day, noticing my nervousness. "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just a bit tired," I lied. In truth, it was getting harder and harder to hide the attraction I felt for him. "If you need anything, I'm here," he said, and his complicit smile made me feel that he knew exactly what I was feeling. These moments of complicity and desire grew every day. I found myself longing for these trips, the casual touches and the smiles we exchanged. I was getting involved in something I couldn't control, and worst of all, I didn't want to stop. The daily runs with Jake became moments of confidences. Every time I got in the car, I felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. He was always there, with a warm smile that made me forget about my problems for a few moments. At first, our conversations were casual, about the weather, the traffic, trivial things. But gradually, we began to share more. I would tell him about my work, my dreams, my frustrations. And he listened attentively, offering advice and words of support. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult day at the office, Jake stopped the car in front of my house. I was about to get out when he leaned over, holding out his hand to help. It was a casual touch, but the electricity that ran through my body at that instant was undeniable. Our gazes met, and for a second, the world seemed to stop. "Are you all right?" he asked, with genuine concern in his eyes. I hesitated, still feeling the warmth of his hand. "Yeah, just a bit tired." He smiled, a complicit smile, full of hidden meanings. "If you need anything, I'm here." That smile stayed with me. That night, while Michael slept next to me, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake. His touch, his gaze. Everything seemed so wrong and yet so right. The next day, our conversations in the car became even deeper. Jake shared stories of his life, his own challenges and dreams. There was an undeniable connection between us, something I couldn't ignore. Every word, every glance, every casual touch seemed to bring us closer together. One day, as he helped me out of the car again, he left his hand in mine for a second longer. "I really enjoy talking to you," he said, his voice low and full of sincerity. "Me too," I replied, feeling my heart beat faster. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. I longed for those moments in the car, those precious minutes when we could just be us. And Jake, always attentive, always present, seemed to feel the same way. "Have you ever felt trapped in your own life?" I asked once, unable to contain my thoughts. He looked at me, his eyes full of understanding. "Yes, many times. But sometimes, finding someone who understands you makes it all worthwhile." Those words stuck in my mind. Jake wasn't just my driver. He had become my confidant, my friend, perhaps something more. Every complicit smile, every casual touch brought us closer together, creating a bond that I knew was dangerous, but which I couldn't resist. And so our daily runs turned into moments of confidences, discoveries, and intense emotions. I knew I was playing with fire, but every moment with Jake was a flame I didn't want to extinguish. The text messages began, innocently enough. Jake and I would exchange information about travel times and details of routes. However, over time, These messages became more personal and intimate. I found myself smiling as I read his words, my heart racing as I typed a reply. One evening, after a long and tiring day at work, I received a message that made my heart soar. "I've been thinking about you all day. How was your day?" I didn't know how to answer without revealing my growing feelings for him. "It was tiring, but better now that I'm talking to you," I replied, hesitantly. The answer came almost immediately. "I feel the same way." I felt a wave of warmth run through my body. These nocturnal conversations were affecting me more than I wanted to admit. I started having increasingly erotic dreams about Jake. I'd wake up sweating, my body yearning for a touch it couldn't have. I would look at Michael, sleeping peacefully next to me, and guilt would consume me. How could I be lusting after another man when I had such a devoted and loving husband? But the attraction to Jake was something I couldn't control. One day, I made up a lie about a social engagement so that I could spend more time with Jake. "I'm going to a charity event tonight," I said to Michael, avoiding his gaze. He smiled and wished me a good night without suspecting a thing. My heart squeezed as I got ready to meet Jake. Jake was waiting for me in the car, his warm smile welcoming me. "Ready for our night of adventure?" he asked, his voice laden with an unspoken promise. My heart was racing as I replied, "More than ready." That night was a turning point for us. We spent hours talking, laughing, and sharing secrets we had never revealed to anyone. The tension between us was palpable, but neither of us dared to make the first move. When I finally returned home, I felt a mixture of guilt and excitement. Michael was in his room, already asleep, and I lay next to him, the weight of my actions crushing me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, my mind tormented by the image of Jake and the guilt of betraying Michael. I knew I was at a crossroads, but every time I thought about ending things with Jake, my heart broke. The connection I felt with him was something I had never experienced before. It was as if he was a lost part of me that I had finally found. The next few days were emotional torture. Every time I was with Michael, I felt a lump in my throat. I tried to act normally, but the guilt was always there. Michael began to notice my restlessness. "Is everything all right?" he asked one evening while we were having dinner. I forced a smile and replied, "Yes, I'm just tired from work." He accepted my answer, but I could see the worry in his eyes. Jake's messages continued, each time more ardent and personal. "I can't stop thinking about you," he wrote one day. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't resist. "I think about you all the time too," I replied. The first lie about a social engagement was just the beginning. I made up other excuses to spend more time with Jake. Each encounter was a mixture of pleasure and guilt. I knew I was walking a fine line, but the attraction to Jake was irresistible. One night, after a particularly intense encounter, Jake took me by the arm and looked deep into my eyes. "We need to talk about this," he said, his voice serious. "What are we doing?" I knew he was right, but I didn't want to face reality. "I don't know," I replied, my voice breaking. "All I know is that I can't stop." Jake sighed and pulled me into a hug. "I can't either," he admitted. We stood there in silence, hugging in the car, both of us aware of the abyss we were about to fall into. The walk by the lake was planned as an innocent moment between Jake and me, but I knew from the start that it wouldn't be like that. The cold night wind mixed with the tension that hung between us. We walked side by side, but the closeness was suffocating. Every step increased the electricity between us, and I couldn't help glancing at him. Jake broke the silence. "Are you okay?" His voice was husky, laden with unspoken intentions. "Yeah, I'm just a bit nervous," I replied, trying to keep my composure. He stopped and looked me in the eye, his fingers lightly brushing my arm. "There's no need to be nervous. We're just taking a walk." But I knew it wasn't just that. His touch made my heart race. The sexual tension was almost unbearable. Every fiber of my being was screaming for me to kiss him right then and there, without thinking about the consequences. "Shall we go somewhere more private?" he suggested, his voice soft but full of desire. I hesitated for a moment, looking out over the lake. "What do you have in mind?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "A motel. It's near here, and no one will see us." My reason screamed at me to refuse, but my body had already made up its mind. "Okay," I whispered, almost inaudibly. The drive to the motel was silent, but the air was charged with anticipation. When we arrived, Jake parked the car and looked at me deeply, as if asking permission for what was about to happen. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. I nodded, unable to speak. I knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. We entered the room, and the atmosphere changed instantly. The place was simple, but what mattered was his presence there, so close to me. Jake closed the door and moved closer, touching my face with a softness that sent shivers down my spine. "You're beautiful," he murmured, before pulling me into a deep, searing kiss. My hands began to explore his body, feeling every muscle, every line. He took me by the waist and laid me on the bed, his eyes never leaving mine. The passion we had repressed for so long finally exploded. Every touch, every kiss, every sigh was a release of built-up tension. Clothes were quickly discarded, and when we were finally skin to skin, the sensation was overwhelming. He was intense, but also gentle, and every movement seemed synchronized with my desire. The night was a mixture of passion and tenderness, something I had never experienced before. When we finally stopped, exhausted and satisfied, Jake pulled me close and whispered in my ear, "I've wanted this for so long." "Me too," I confessed, feeling a mixture of happiness and guilt. "But what do we do now?" He sighed, running his fingers through my hair. "Let's enjoy the moment. The future can wait." And there, in Jake's arms, I decided that, at least for one night, I would let the future wait. Guilt would come later, but at that moment, I just wanted to feel the warmth and comfort of being with him. The passion we shared was intense, and deep down, I knew that this night would change everything. But at that moment, nothing else mattered, but the two of us. The next morning, I woke up in a whirlwind of emotions. Remorse consumed me, but I couldn't help the excitement that still pulsed through my veins. The image of Jake and me together filled my mind. Every detail of last night made me shiver with desire, but also with guilt. Michael was next to me in bed, sleeping peacefully, and this only intensified the weight of what I had done. I got up slowly, trying not to make a sound, and went to the bathroom. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and wondered how it had come to this. I loved Michael, but the attraction to Jake was undeniable, almost irresistible. I washed my face several times, hoping to erase the memory of the night before, but it was no use. At breakfast, Michael looked at me and smiled. "Good morning, love. Sleep well?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, I did. And you?" He didn't suspect a thing, and that made me even more nervous. The guilt was almost unbearable, but at the same time, I couldn't wait to see Jake again. The daily trips with Jake continued, and every time I got in the car, I felt my heart racing. He looked at me through the rearview mirror with that complicit smile, and I knew he felt the same way. It was getting hard to keep my composure. During one of these trips, I couldn't help but ask, "Jake, do you feel guilty?" He looked at me, surprised by my question. "Sometimes, but I can't stop thinking about you, about us." His sincerity touched me, and I knew I was in the same boat. The fantasies during these trips became more and more daring. In my mind, I saw myself giving myself to him in ways I had never imagined before. Every touch, every look was a reminder of what we had shared and what we could still experience. One day, while we were in traffic, he held my hand. "I like to take risks, you know that?" he whispered, with a teasing smile. I felt a chill in my stomach and knew he was serious. I was also beginning to enjoy the adrenaline rush, the danger of being discovered. Coming home and pretending to be normal was a challenge. Michael began to notice my strange behavior. "Are you okay? You seem distracted lately." I shook my head, trying to disguise it. "I'm just tired. Work is exhausting me." He accepted the explanation, but I knew I couldn't go on like this forever. The line between guilt and excitement was thin, and I was walking it every day. Every moment with Jake left me more divided, more confused. I knew I had to make a decision, but the thought of losing the passion I felt for him was unbearable. That morning, while I was in the shower, I decided that I needed to talk to Jake. We needed to find a way to deal with all this. When I got into the car, he noticed my serious expression. "What happened?" he asked, concerned. "We need to talk," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "What about?" he asked. But before I could answer, my phone rang. It was Michael. I answered, trying to sound natural. "Hi, love. Is everything all right?" he asked. "Yeah, everything's fine. I'm on my way to work," I lied. When I hung up, Jake looked me in the eye. "We can't go on like this, Jake. It's getting too hard." He nodded, understanding. "I know, but I don't want to lose you." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Even I don't want to lose you," I admitted. "But we need to think about how we're going to deal with this." He held my hand again, and at that moment, I knew we were in this together, whatever came next. Jake and I were sitting in the car, the sound of the rain beating against the glass, mixing with the tension-filled silence. He was behind the wheel, and I was next to him, both of us avoiding looking directly at each other. The darkness outside seemed to reflect my state of mind. My fingers trembled as I adjusted the rearview mirror, trying to find some stability in the reflection of the wet street. Jake broke the silence, his voice low and husky. "Are you sure everything's okay?" I nodded, but the truth was that my heart was pounding in my chest. "Yes, I'm fine," I lied. How did we get to this point? It was the question burning in my mind, but I didn't have the courage to say it. It had all started so innocently, with little flirtations and casual touches, and now we were here, on the verge of an escapade that could change everything. Jake glanced at me, his eyes reflecting the same mixture of desire and concern that I felt. "Am I sure you want to do this?" he asked, his hand hovering over mine on the console between us. "I do," I replied, my voice firmer than I really felt. "I'm just nervous." He squeezed my hand, the warmth of his touch bringing me a sense of comfort and excitement at the same time. "I am too," he admitted. "But it's going to be good. Let's forget everything for a weekend." The elaborate lie to Michael about a business trip was still weighing on my conscience. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but the adrenaline and passion I felt for Jake made it irresistible. "Michael believes I'm going to a conference," I said, trying to ease the guilt that was consuming me. "He doesn't suspect a thing." Jake smiled, a smile that always managed to disarm me. "Then let's go. Let's enjoy this time together." The journey to the hotel was quick, but every minute felt like an eternity. As soon as we arrived at the room, the tension between us exploded into a whirlwind of kisses and caresses. Jake pulled me to him, his lips meeting mine urgently. "I've waited so long for this," he murmured against my skin, his hands exploring my body as if he wanted to memorize every inch. I moaned in response, feeling the same desperate need. "Me too," I whispered, pulling him closer. The night was a mixture of unbridled passion and tender moments I hadn't expected. Every touch, every kiss, seemed to etch itself into my memory, a reminder of what we were risking. At some point, lying side by side, panting and satisfied, the fear of being discovered came back to haunt me. "Jake," I began hesitantly, "what if someone finds out? What if Michael finds out?" He turned to me, his eyes serious. "They won't find out. We've taken every precaution. And as for Michael, you need to decide what you really want." I knew he was right, but the decision seemed impossible. The stable, secure love I felt for Michael was real, but the burning passion Jake aroused in me was undeniable. However, at that moment, all I wanted was to enjoy the time we had together. Jake pulled me closer, his body warm against mine. "We'll worry about that later. Right now, I just want you." I kissed him again, immersing myself in the sensation of being with him, trying to forget the fear and guilt that haunted me. The adrenaline of being away from home, of being with Jake, was intoxicating. When morning came, reality knocked on the door. We needed to get back, and I knew that pretending to be normal with Michael would be a challenge. But for now, I allowed myself a few more moments in Jake's arms, trying to record every detail before returning to the life I had chosen to complicate. "I love you," Jake whispered, his lips brushing mine. "I love you too," I replied, feeling a twinge of pain as I thought about what this meant for the future. As we prepared to leave, the fear of being discovered continued to haunt me, but the excitement of being with Jake made everything seem worthwhile. I knew I would have to make difficult choices soon, but for now, I was willing to take the risks. The return to routine was more difficult than I had imagined. Every morning, as I faced Michael at the coffee table, I felt a sharp pang of guilt mixed with a strange excitement. Jake was still there, always on time, always with that smile that made me melt inside. Pretending to be normal became a daily challenge, and I found myself increasingly worried about Michael's suspicions. "You've been acting different," Michael commented one evening while we were having dinner. "Is something bothering you?" "It's just you," I replied quickly, looking down at my plate. I could feel his eyes on me, searching for answers I wasn't ready to give. Michael's suspicions were only growing. I could see it in every question, in every lingering glance. And, to make matters even more complicated, Jake gave me an ultimatum. "You need to decide. Either you leave Michael or we continue like this, in hiding," he said, as he drove calmly, his eyes fixed on the road. "Jake, I don't know what to do. It's all so complicated," I replied, my voice shaking. I felt my heart squeezing, torn between the safe, stable love that Michael was offering me and the overwhelming passion that Jake was awakening in me. "Decide soon, because I can't go on like this," Jake insisted, his voice firm but full of restrained pain. The indecision tore me apart. I loved Michael, in a way that can only be built up through years of living together, sharing dreams and routines. But Jake was the flame that I didn't even know still existed inside me, a passion that consumed me and made me feel alive like never before. The days passed, and I felt more and more lost. Michael continued to watch me with a suspicious eye, and Jake was getting impatient. I knew I needed to make a decision, but whatever I chose, someone would get hurt. And honestly, I wasn't sure I was ready to face the consequences of whatever choice I made. "You really need to make a decision," Jake repeated one evening, as we were parked in front of my house, after another long run, where the silence between us was fraught with tension. "I know, Jake, I know," I mumbled, my eyes full of tears that I wouldn't let fall. Just give me some more time. We don't have all the time in the world, he replied, his voice now softer, but still with a weight that crushed me. With each passing day, indecision ate me up inside. I knew I had to do something, but the thought of losing either of the two men in my life paralyzed me. How to choose between Michael's stability and Jake's passion. How to choose between love and desire. The nights became even longer, filled with insomnia and confused thoughts. The mornings, in turn, became a game of disguise, trying to hide the dark circles under my eyes and the despair that was building up on my face from Michael. When I finally made the decision to stay with Jake and keep our secret, I felt a mixture of relief and guilt. I knew I was choosing the path of passion, even if it meant betraying Michael's trust. But every moment with Jake was so intense, so full of life, that I simply couldn't resist. Jake reacted in an unexpected way when I told him about my choice. "So, are you really going to go through with it?" he asked, his eyes fixed on mine, as if he wanted to read my soul. "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling. "I can't imagine my life without these moments we have together." He smiled, but there was something else in that smile, something I couldn't quite decipher. "I have a proposition for you," he said, taking my hand. "One last date in the car, just the two of us, no rush, no interruptions." My heart raced. The idea was both exciting and terrifying. "I don't know, Jake," I hesitated. "It's getting riskier and riskier. Trust me," he insisted. "It will be special. Think of it as a celebration of what we have." I knew I should say no, but the temptation was too great. "All right," I agreed, reluctantly. "But just this once." On the appointed night, I got into the car with my heart in my mouth, my hands trembling. The sound of the rain hitting the roof of the car seemed to amplify the tension in the air. Jake was there, waiting for me, and at the sight of his welcoming smile, I felt a warmth run through my body. "I knew you'd come," he said, pulling me into a passionate kiss. That kiss seemed to say everything that words could not. It was a mixture of desire, love, and a touch of desperation. "Jake, what if someone catches us?" I asked, my voice breaking. "They won't," he replied confidently. "Trust me." I wanted to believe him, so I decided to give myself over completely at that moment. "I want to remember this forever," I murmured against his lips. He smiled and pulled me closer, his hands exploring every inch of my body. The sound of the rain and the silence of the night around us created an almost magical atmosphere. It was as if the whole world had stopped, leaving only the two of us to exist in that small space. "You're everything to me," Jake whispered in my ear, making my heart race even faster. Suddenly, I heard a sound. Footsteps approaching. My body tensed, and Jake noticed. "What is it?" he asked, worried. "I think I heard someone," I whispered, fear growing inside me. He looked around, trying to see through the rain-fogged windows. For a moment, I thought it was all over, that we would be discovered right there. But the footsteps moved away, and silence reigned. "That was close," Jake said, letting out a sigh of relief. "Let's get out of here," I suggested, my voice still shaky. "No," he insisted, bringing my face close to his. "Let's enjoy this moment. Don't let fear ruin what we have." I knew he was right. This moment was ours, and I didn't want anything to destroy it. We surrendered again, each touch, each kiss, charged with an almost painful intensity. When we finally pulled away, panting, I felt that something had changed. "I love you, Jake," I said, the words coming out before I could stop myself. He looked at me, his eyes shining. "I love you too," he replied, and in that moment, I knew that whatever happened from then on, those moments would always be a part of me. I got out of the car that night with a mixture of emotions: excitement, fear, guilt. Everything was mixed up inside me. But one thing was certain: every moment with Jake was worth it. And as much as reality surrounded us, those moments in the car were a refuge, a place where we could truly be ourselves. I arrived at the car parked on a deserted street that fateful night. The rain was falling heavily, creating a constant melody on the roof of the vehicle. My heart was beating fast, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. When I opened the car door, the first thing I saw was Jake. He was half naked, waiting for me. His presence, always so inviting, was now almost irresistible. "You came," he said, his tone laden with an expectation that I couldn't ignore. My gaze traveled down his body, the sight of his partially uncovered skin making me feel a warmth creep up my neck. "Jake, this is crazy," I whispered, still hesitant, as I got into the car and closed the door behind me. The atmosphere inside the car was charged, almost suffocating, but in a way that made my whole body tingle. He leaned closer, his eyes fixed on mine. "We need this. I need you," he murmured, his voice low and husky. I felt his words vibrate inside me, as if each syllable was touching my skin. Before I could reply, we heard the sudden sound of approaching footsteps. My body froze. Adrenaline rushed through me as my heart raced. Who could it be? What if it was someone who knew Michael? What if it was Michael? "Someone's coming," I said, my voice trembling with fear. Jake looked quickly out of the window, his eyes scanning the darkness of the street. "Stay calm," he said, trying to keep his composure. "Let's wait and see if they pass." I curled up on the bench, trying to be as quiet as possible. The footsteps were getting louder, closer. I could feel my breathing getting heavier, almost panting. The fear of being discovered was almost as intense as the desire I felt for Jake. Footsteps passed slowly by the car, and I held my breath. The silhouette of a person appeared in the window, and my heart almost stopped. But to my surprise, the person kept walking, and soon the sound of footsteps diminished until they disappeared completely. Jake let out a sigh of relief. "We barely escaped," he said, looking at me again. "Are you all right?" I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "That was too close," I said, my voice still shaking. "We can't go on like this. It's too risky." Jake moved closer, his hands caressing my face. "I know it's risky," he said softly, "but I can't stay away from you. Every moment we spend together is worth any risk." I closed my eyes, trying to process everything. The feel of Jake's touch, his voice, the danger. Everything was a jumble of emotions that left me completely lost. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice almost a whisper. "I'm torn between what I feel for you and what I have with Michael." Jake pulled me closer, his body warm against mine. "We'll find a way," he promised. "But right now, I just want to enjoy this moment with you." I looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity and passion burning there. Despite the fear, guilt, and confusion, I knew I couldn't resist. I leaned towards him, our lips meeting in a kiss that was both desperate and full of desire. At that moment, the world outside disappeared. The rain continued to beat down on the car, but all I could feel was Jake, his skin against mine, his touch that made me forget everything. Even though I knew we were playing with fire, I couldn't pull away. Every moment with Jake was a risk, but it was also an escape from my everyday life, a life that seemed further and further away. I knew we couldn't go on like this forever. The fear of being discovered was always there, haunting every encounter. But that night, in the car parked on a deserted street, I chose to forget all that. I chose to surrender to desire, to the moment, and to Jake.